The air in Baron Voss's great hall was thick with the scent of roasted meat, spilled wine, and the cloying perfume of men whose cruelty was their finest garment. Elara stood on a small wooden block in the center of the room, a chattel under the jaundiced glow of a dozen chandeliers, their crystal facets seeming to mock her with 1,000 fractured reflections of her own face. The birthmark, a splash of deep crimson that bloomed from her temple and swept across her cheekbone like a fallen autumn leaf, felt as if it were on fire beneath the collective stare of the assembly. Voss, a man whose girth was matched only by his arrogance, circled her platform, tapping a polished cane against his leather boot. He presented her not as a person, but as a curiosity, an object of scornful amusement. A rare bloom from the savage wilds, he announced, his voice slick with contempt, marred by the maker's clumsy hand. A wave of brutish laughter rolled through the hall. She was to be sold, an indentured servant to pay for a debt her family had never incurred, a fiction crafted by Voss to punish her father's defiance. The bidding was a sport, each call a fresh lash of humiliation. Men shouted numbers, their eyes crawling over her, seeing only the mark, the imagined wildness, the joke. Elara kept her gaze fixed on a knot in the floorboards, her spirit curled into a tight, cold ball in the pit of her stomach. Then, the raucous noise faltered. A man had moved from the shadowed alcoves near the back of the hall. He was built on a scale that dwarfed the portly merchants and landowners, a figure of granite and silence in a room of chattering clay. He wore the simple, dusty clothes of a homesteader, yet he moved with an unnerving stillness that commanded more attention than Voss's blustering ever could. He did not shout a bid. He walked directly to the platform, his heavy boots making no sound on the plush carpets, and placed a leather pouch on the block beside her feet. It landed with a soft, definitive thud that echoed louder than any shout. Voss's sneer tightened as he opened the pouch. Gold. More than enough to silence the room, more than she was worth as a joke, more than enough to be an insult to the Baron's sport. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. The stranger's eyes, the color of a stormy sky, met Elara's for a fleeting second. There was no pity in them, no lust, nothing she could name. There was only a profound and unsettling quiet. Voss, his face purpled with fury at having his game so thoroughly ruined, had no choice but to accept. The gold was real, the transaction public. With a flick of his wrist, he dismissed her. Sold, he spat, to the stone man from the wastes. The journey from the suffocating decadence of the town to the stark, windswept expanse of the northern territories was a passage between worlds, conducted in a silence more unnerving than any threat. The man, whose name she did not know, had simply untied her hands, gestured towards a small buckboard wagon, and begun to walk. He did not ride, but led the tired mule by its rope, his long, steady strides eating up the dusty miles. Elara sat rigidly on the wagon's bench, every muscle coiled in anticipation of a blow that never came. She had been passed from one form of damnation to another, she thought, from the public cage of the Baron's hall to the private one of this grim giant. She studied his back, a vast landscape of worn leather and corded muscle. He was an outcast, she knew that much from the whispers in town, a man who had bought the most useless patch of land imaginable, a stretch of rocky soil and blighted canyons that everyone else had abandoned, and had somehow managed to survive on it alone. The air grew thinner, cleaner, carrying the scent of pine and dry earth. The sun beat down, and he stopped once to offer her a canteen of water, his movements economical and precise, his gaze never lingering on her face. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the horizon, they arrived. The ranch was less a home and more a stubborn scar upon the landscape, a small, solid cabin and a sturdy barn built of dark, weathered timber, huddled against the base of a towering mesa. It was a place of profound loneliness, yet it possessed a clean, fierce beauty that the town, with all its finery, could never claim. He led the mule to the barn, unhitched the wagon, and then turned to her. He did not touch her. He simply pointed to the cabin door. "There is food on the hearth," he said, his voice a low rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. "The room to the left is yours." She slid from the wagon, her legs stiff and unsteady, and entered the cabin. It was spare but immaculate. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and a pot of thick stew bubbled over the flames. A clean linen shift and a pair of sturdy trousers were folded neatly on the edge of a simple cot in the small adjacent room. He had given her a lock for her door. She stood in the center of the warm, firelit space, the scent of stew filling her senses, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the tight, cold knot of fear inside her began to loosen its grip, replaced by a bewildering and fragile sense of confusion. Days bled into a silent, rhythmic pattern, a life governed by the rising and setting of the sun. Cale, as she learned his name was from a faded brand on a saddle, worked from before dawn until long after dusk. He moved with a relentless, focused energy, mending fences that seemed to hold back the entire wilderness, clearing stubborn rocks from a small patch of earth he was determined to turn into a garden, and tending to his small herd of hardy livestock with a quiet, almost reverent touch. He never spoke to her, never issued a command or an expectation. He simply existed in his sphere of labor, and she in hers of watchful silence. At first, Ilara did nothing, convinced this was a test, a prelude to some unknown cruelty. But the cruelty never materialized. There was only the steady provision of food, the safety of her locked room, and the vast, imposing quiet of her purchaser. Slowly, tentatively, she began to move beyond the cabin's threshold. She started by sweeping the porch, then by drawing water from the well. She found a small vegetable patch behind the cabin and began to pull the weeds, her fingers rediscovering the familiar comfort of cool, dark soil. He noticed her work but never commented, though one morning she found a set of well-made gardening tools left neatly by the back door. Her world, which had been a storm of public shame, shrank to this small, quiet orbit of two solitary beings. One evening, a late frost threatened the small, blossoming apple tree Cale treasured. He had been out late, tracking a lost calf. Ilara saw the descending cold in the crispness of the air and, without thinking, took every spare blanket from the cabin and carefully wrapped the fragile branches. When Cale returned, weary and covered in dust, he stopped and stared at the swaddled tree. He looked over at her, where she stood silhouetted in the doorway, and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The next morning, a small, intricately carved wooden bird lay on her windowsill. It was impossibly detailed, its tiny wings seeming ready for flight. It was not a payment or a reward. It was a message, spoken in the only language he knew. It said, "I see you." The fragile peace of their shared solitude was broken by the arrival of others. A family, a gaunt man, a woman with eyes hollowed out by despair, and two small, silent children, stumbled out of the wilderness, their clothes in tatters. They had been tenants on a plot of land bordering Voss's vast estate and had been driven out, their home burned, for failing to pay a new, impossible tax. Cale found them near the creek, on the verge of collapse. Without a word of question, he led them back to the ranch, guiding their exhausted mule into his barn and showing the woman and her children into the main room of the cabin. Ilara watched from her doorway, her own terror mirrored in the family's frightened faces. The woman flinched when she saw Ilara's marked face, but Ilara did not retreat. Instead, she moved to the hearth, ladled a bowl of stew, and held it out to the woman. It was a simple gesture, but for Ilara, it was a seismic shift, an act of reaching out when her entire life had been a lesson in pulling away. The family stayed, Cale giving them his own room and taking to sleeping in the barn. Weeks later, as the summer heat baked the canyons, Cale was clearing a rock slide from the path to the upper pastures. He reached for a large stone and recoiled with a sharp cry. A scorpion, black and lethal, scuttled away into the dust. He stumbled back to the cabin, his face already pale with sweat, a venomous red streak crawling up his arm. Ilara acted on pure instinct. She pushed him onto his cot, her hands moving with a forgotten certainty. She remembered her grandmother, the herbs she grew, the poultices she mixed. She sliced open the wound to let it bleed, then ran to the garden, crushing yarrow leaves and mixing them with clay and water to make a paste. For 2 days, he burned with fever, lost in a delirium that brought fractured whispers of a different life, of shouting, of steel ringing on steel, of a name, Liana, spoken in anguish. Ilara stayed by his side, bathing his face with cool water, forcing broth and herbal tea between his cracked lips. On the morning of the 3rd day, the fever broke. He opened his eyes, his gaze clear and focused. He looked at her hands tending to his bandages, at her face, weary but resolute. A profound gratitude shone in his storm-gray eyes. "Thank you," he rasped. And she, who had not spoken a full sentence to him in all these months, found her voice. "Cale," she said, the name a soft prayer, acclaiming. He froze, his entire body going still. He had heard his name 1,000 times in his life, shouted in anger, spoken in command, whispered in fear. But he had never heard it spoken like this, with a tenderness that healed more than just the poison in his veins. It was the sound of a lock turning, opening a door he thought had been sealed forever. The arrival of the first family was like a single stone tossed into a still pond, its ripples spreading outward, carrying a message of sanctuary across the blighted lands. Soon, others followed, drawn by whispers of a place where Baron Voss's shadow did not reach. An old blacksmith, his hands gnarled and scarred from a fire Voss's men had set in his forge, arrived with nothing but the hammer he'd saved from the ashes. A scholar, declared a heretic for owning books that questioned the Baron's authority, came clutching a satchel of worn manuscripts. A widow with 4 children, a young couple whose marriage was forbidden, a disgraced militiaman, they came, a slow, steady trickle of the dispossessed. Cale's homestead, once a bastion of solitude, began to transform. It was no longer a ranch, but a settlement. The quiet man accepted them all, his silence a broad shield that offered protection without judgment. He shared his resources freely, organized the work of building new, simple dwellings against the canyon walls, and gave each newcomer a purpose. But it was Elara who gave them a community. Her initial act of kindness to the first family had unlocked something within her. She moved among the newcomers, her voice still soft, but now filled with a quiet confidence. She organized the stores of food, ensuring everyone had a share. She established a place for the children to learn, using the scholars' precious books. She tended to the sick and comforted the grieving, her own past suffering creating a deep well of empathy. The birthmark on her face, the brand of her former shame, was slowly redefined. To these people, it was not a flaw. It was simply her, the gentle, steady woman who had helped them find their footing in a world that had tried to erase them. Cale watched her transformation with a quiet awe. He saw the shy, broken woman he had bought for a pouch of gold blossom into a leader. While he provided the muscle and the security, she provided the heart. In the evenings, he began to teach the men to fight, not with the brawling tactics of thugs, but with disciplined, efficient movements that spoke of formal training and a past steeped in violence. He was preparing them, for he knew that the world they had built was a defiance that Baron Voss would not tolerate for long. The news of the growing settlement in the canyons of the Forsaken reached Baron Voss like the stench of rot. He called it Cale's Folly, a haven for the trash he had so carefully swept from his lands. That these people dared not only to exist but to thrive was a personal affront, a challenge to the absolute nature of his power. He would not lead an army against them, that would grant the place a dignity it did not deserve. Instead, he would send a message, a reminder of who held dominion over every rock and every soul in this territory. He dispatched his foreman, a cruel and sycophantic man named Malachi, along with a dozen of his most brutal enforcers. They rode into the fledgling community not like soldiers, but like a plague, their horses trampling through the carefully tended gardens, their laughter a harsh, grating sound in the peaceful air. The settlers, armed with little more than farm tools and a desperate will to protect their home, gathered in the central clearing, fear a cold stone in their bellies. Cale moved to the front, placing himself between the riders and the people, his sheer physical presence a challenge. He was unarmed, his hands loose at his sides, but his stance was that of a mountain that would not be moved. Malachi sneered down at him from his saddle. "The Baron sends his regards, Stone Man. He finds your collection of vermin distasteful. He suggests you scatter them." Before his force to fumigate, his eyes then fell upon Elara, who had come to stand beside Cale. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face as he recognized her from the auction. "And look what we have here." The Baron's little joke. "Still trying to hide that ugly face of yours in the shadows?" Elara felt a familiar tremor of shame, but it was distant now, a ghost of a feeling. She looked not at Malachi, but at the faces of her people, the children hiding behind their mothers, the blacksmith clutching his hammer, the old scholar standing with a defiant terror. She drew strength from them, from the home they had built together. She took a step forward, her gaze level and clear. "This is our home now," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying an unshakable weight that cut through the tension. "We are not vermin. And we will not scatter." Malachi was so taken aback by her audacity that he could only stare. The marked girl, the broken thing, was speaking with the authority of a queen. He let out a harsh laugh, wheeled his horse around, and kicked down a section of the new corral fence as a parting gesture. "The Baron is a patient man," he spat. "But his patience has an end. We will be back." The threat hung in the air long after the thunder of their hooves had faded, a promise of fire and ruin. A palpable fear settled over the community in the wake of the enforcer's visit. The settlers had come seeking refuge, not war, and the spectre of Voss's wrath was a terror they all knew intimately. Whispers of leaving, of scattering back into the wilderness to hide, circulated like a fever. That evening, Ilara called a gathering around the central fire. She stood before them, the firelight dancing across her face, illuminating the crimson mark and the fierce resolve in her eyes. "I was once afraid of my own shadow," she began, her voice resonating with a strength no one, least of all herself, knew she possessed. "I let shame be my master. But living here, with all of you, I have learned that a home is not just a place to hide. It is a place to stand. If we run now, we will be running forever. Here, together, we have a chance." Her words, simple and earnest, rekindled a spark of defiance in the weary hearts of the people. They would stay. They would fight. The days that followed were a blur of desperate, focused activity. Cale became their general, the silent rancher revealing the mind of a master strategist. He mapped the terrain, identifying choke points in the canyons, places for ambushes, and defensible positions. He intensified the training, turning farmers into a disciplined militia. The blacksmith, his purpose rekindled, fired his forge day and night, hammering plowshares not into swords, but into sharp, sturdy spearheads and caltrops to cripple horses. The women, led by Ilara, organized a supply chain of water, bandages, and food, and learned to create diversions with smoke and noise. Everyone had a role. During a rare moment of quiet, as they stood on the ridge overlooking their valley, Cale turned to Ilara. The setting sun cast a warm, golden light upon them. He reached out, his calloused fingers hesitating for a moment before gently, reverently, tracing the edge of her birthmark. She didn't flinch. His touch was not one of curiosity or pity, but of profound acceptance. It was an answer to a question she had been asking herself her whole life. "In the town," he said, his voice a low whisper, softer than she had ever heard it, "they called it a stain. A flaw." He looked directly into her eyes, his own grey gaze holding a universe of unspoken feeling. "I see a constellation. I see the map of a survivor." In that instant, the last vestiges of her shame burned away, consumed by the warmth of his words, leaving only a love as fierce and resolute as the landscape around them. The attack came at dawn, as Cale had predicted. A horn, arrogant and cruel, echoed through the canyons, announcing the arrival of Voss's army. It was not a dozen enforcers this time, but more than 50, a private army of mercenaries and thugs clad in black leather, led by Malachi and the Baron himself, who watched from a safe distance on a magnificent white steed. They expected to ride in and crush the settlement in a single, brutal charge. They were wrong. As the first wave of riders entered the narrow mouth of the main canyon, Cale gave the signal. A volley of arrows, loosed by men hidden in the rocks above, rained down. A massive deadfall, triggered by a cut rope, crashed onto the path, creating chaos and blocking the advance. The charge broke into a confused melee. The battle was not one of pitched lines, but of guerrilla warfare. The settlers used their intimate knowledge of the terrain, striking from hidden crevices and then melting back into the rocks. The blacksmith and his small crew held the main path with long spears, turning the narrow passage into a death trap. Cale was everywhere at once, a phantom of vengeance. He moved with a lethal grace that was terrifying to behold, his long knife and a heavy wood axe his only weapons. He was not a brawler, he was a dancer of death, each movement precise, each strike fatal. He flowed through the battle, shoring up weak points, protecting the less experienced fighters, his body a living shield. He sought out the largest threats, dismantling them with a brutal efficiency that spoke of a past he had tried to bury in this soil. Ilara was not on the front line. Her fight was of a different kind. She had established a command post in a sheltered cave overlooking the valley, from which she directed the flow of the battle. She sent runners with instructions, coordinated the movements of their small, scattered groups, and organized the care of the wounded. Her calm, steady presence was the anchor in the storm, her voice a beacon of unwavering hope that cut through the din of combat and the screams of the injured. She was the mind, he was the sword, and together, they were the heart and soul of the resistance. The settlers' fierce and clever defense had broken the back of the Baron's assault, turning his organized army into pockets of panicked, desperate men. Enraged by the humiliation, Baron Voss himself rode forward, his face a mask of apoplectic fury. He cared nothing for strategy now, only for vengeance. He saw Ilara, momentarily exposed as she moved between the command post and the makeshift infirmary, and spurred his horse toward her, his sword drawn. "The marked witch," he bellowed. "It all ends with you." The remaining enforcers rallied to him, sensing the battle's focus shifting to a single, personal confrontation. They surged toward her, a tide of black leather and glinting steel. Ilara stood her ground, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her expression defiant. Before they could reach her, Cale appeared, a blood-soaked and terrifying spectre. He threw himself in front of her, his axe held ready. He was breathing heavily, a deep gash bleeding freely from his side, but his eyes burned with a cold, protective fire. He met the Baron's charge head-on. The fight that followed was a clash of two opposing forces, Voss's arrogant, flashy swordsmanship against Cale's raw, economical brutality. Steel rang against steel, the sounds echoing off the canyon walls. Voss was skilled, but his anger made him sloppy. Cale, though wounded, fought with a chilling purpose, his every move calculated to defend, to parry, to find an opening. He ignored the lesser blows that bit at him, focusing only on his singular target. With a roar, Cale lunged inside the Baron's guard, not with his axe, but with his body, slamming into the man and knocking him from his horse. On the ground, disarmed and gasping, the Baron was just another fleshy, frightened man. Cale stood over him, his axe raised. For a moment, the entire battlefield held its breath. Then, with a shuddering sigh, Cale lowered the weapon. He would not become the monster they had made him. He turned his back on the groveling Baron and walked toward Ilara. The remaining mercenaries, their leader defeated and their will broken, threw down their weapons or fled into the wilderness. The battle was over. As the adrenaline faded, Cale's strength finally gave out. He stumbled, his legs buckling, and collapsed to his knees. Ilara rushed to him, catching him before he hit the ground. She cradled his head in her lap, her hands desperately trying to staunch the bleeding from his side. For the first time since she was a child, she wept, her tears falling not from shame or fear, but from a love so fierce it felt like it would break her heart. In the quiet aftermath, the settlement began to heal. Cale's life hung by a thread for days, but under Ilara's constant, tender care, he slowly mended. His recovery mirrored that of their community, though scarred and battered, they were not broken. They were free. Baron Voss's power, built on fear and intimidation, crumbled with his public defeat. Stripped of his authority and his enforcers, he became a ghost in his own opulent hall, his reign of terror over. The story of the settlers' victory spread, carried on the wind like a seed of hope. They had not just defended a piece of land, they had defended an idea. The settlement, once Cale's folly, became known as Providence, a place where the dispossessed could find a home. Months later, a vibrant autumn painted the canyons in hues of gold and fire. Providence was no longer a rugged camp but a thriving town. New homes nestled against the mesa, smoke curled from a dozen chimneys, and the laughter of children echoed in the crisp air. The fields, once barren, were heavy with harvest. Ilara stood with Cale on the ridge where he had once told her she was a constellation. The setting sun bathed the valley in a soft, ethereal light. He was healed, though a long, pale scar traced a path along his side, a permanent reminder of the price of their freedom. He stood beside her, his quiet strength a comforting presence that had become as essential to her as breathing. She looked out at the home they had built, at the families who lived without fear, and a profound peace settled in her heart. The crimson mark on her cheek felt warm in the evening light, no longer a brand of otherness but an integral part of the woman she had become, a leader, a healer, a founder. Cale reached out and took her hand, his large, calloused fingers lacing through hers. He didn't need to speak. Their shared journey had forged a language far deeper than words, a language of mutual respect, of shared burdens, and of a resilient, abiding love. They had been two broken outcasts, thrown together by a cruel joke, but in the crucible of hardship, they had forged a new world from the pieces, finding not just refuge, but redemption, in the sanctuary they had built in each other's hearts.